Well, good evening. My name is William Burg. I'm a historian. I'm not affiliated with any archive, organization, or museum. I'm basically a hobbyist doing this on my own. And I include that disclaimer because, to be honest, I'm very much politically on a particular side regarding this issue. Obviously, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this was because of Measure A, the strong mayor local initiative, which I personally don't agree with and oppose, in part because of my research on the city's previous efforts at having a strong mayor form of government, which didn't really meet the needs of many of the populace. The date today is September 23rd, 2020. And again, my name is William Burg. The title of this talk is Sacramento's Strong Mayor Era. And that era started in 1893. But before that, Sacramento had a couple of earlier forms of government. Up in 1893, they were working with a political system, as a charter that was set up in 1863. Sacramento was administered by 3 elected trustees with staggered 1-year terms, 1 trustee each in charge of police, streets, and the water system. Now, by the 1890s, the city was growing and needed a more formal form of government. And the 1863 charter prevented potential abuse, but also to some extent limited growth. Now, the size of the city had grown, but since the gold rush and the opening of the Central Pacific Railroad, Sacramento had seen its state importance diminish. Sacramento, from the era of the gold rush through the late 1870s, was the second largest city on the West Coast, second largest city in California, second only to San Francisco, which was about three times larger. But Los Angeles, San Diego, Portland, Seattle were either small farm towns or really didn't exist yet when Sacramento was founded. And that changed over the course of the second half of the 19th century for a multitude of reasons. Part was geography. Seattle and Portland weren't around any other cities. They became the natural primate city for those regions. Los Angeles had an extremely good natural port, was far enough away from San Francisco where it didn't have that influence, plus the major influence of a second railroad. And so when Central Pacific Railroad's monopoly on rail transit in California was broken by the arrival of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, Los Angeles went from being a cow town to being the second largest city in California, usurping Sacramento's position. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe continued north and entered the Bay Area, ending up in Oakland. And then Oakland usurped Sacramento's new position as the third largest city in California after they had a second railroad. In both cases, because these were largely uncontrolled industries, the 2 railroads started a rate war against each other, which created a housing bubble. Now, both of those were followed by a collapse, but the point is Sacramento saw its influence shrinking, and we were geographically hemmed in by the fact that we were surrounded by water through much of the year, and our climate was pretty hot. We were, not as hot as today, obviously, but still pretty hot with no air conditioning. And so people didn't so much want to move here. It really had very little to do with vision or other kind of more existential means. It was money, geography, and to some extent luck. But this was Sacramento at the time. The city limits were 31st Street and Y Street, otherwise known as Alhambra Boulevard and Broadway. And we had a swamp in the upper left-hand corner that was slowly being turned into the Central Pacific shops, and a population between 25 to, toward the end of the period, about 40,000 people. And this is a street scene from 1868 showing the Sacramento of that era, in need of some professional government. Another big hit that happened was our railroad, the Central Pacific Railroad, founded in Sacramento in defiance of San Francisco's railroad interests, left town in the 1870s. We still had their shops, the only place west of Pennsylvania where full-size steam locomotives were built. We still had their old mansions, and we had the Crocker family, the Edwin Bryant Crocker family, because EB had passed away before they could move to San Francisco. But we lost our main claim to fame in terms of corporate headquarters. Another blow that led some civic leaders to say, what can we do differently? What can we do to make this into a professional, modern 19th century city? And that included the form of government. One other political note, Black history is a small part of Sacramento history, but it is an essential portion of Sacramento history. And so I wanted to talk about some of the political involvement of Sacramento's African American community, which if you've seen any of my other talks, you may have heard a little bit about. But the Sacramento ZOUAVES were a armed militia of African American men, including some veterans, that was also a political organization. They were principally Republicans, the Republicans being the party of Lincoln and abolition, and they organized and disseminated the African American vote in Sacramento. So there were black voters, and they were a demographic, even though they were small, really only about 1% of the populace, but an important 1% that had the vote. Unusual as a lot of the other migrants to Sacramento who weren't white did not have the Chinese, for example. First generation Chinese were ineligible to be citizens. And so this organization, the ZOUAVES, was influential for generations later, despite their relatively small size. And the political scene was mostly, well, this is a bar room, but it's also a polling place. And because only men could vote, and pretty much only white men, the bar room and the boardroom of the city council were fairly close to identical in composition, white men. And in order to modernize, you needed some people interested in modernity. And there were some organizations in the 1880s. The Sutter Club, for example, formed in the late 1880s, local businessmen who wanted a more modern, more ambitious, more powerful Sacramento and were concerned about this loss of status. They chose John Sutter as what they envisioned as the original agrarian dreamer of Sacramento, who had this agricultural vision for the region. Many of them weren't necessarily farmers themselves, but considered themselves farmers because they owned agricultural interest and they hired workers to work in their regional farms. And so they wanted to focus on that vision of farming as Sacramento's defining moment, even though really up until that point, we hadn't really been a farm town. We were a merchant town, we were the railroad town, we were an industrial town and growing more industrial. But they had a vision for what they wanted to see, and to carry it out, they applied with the state of California and with the voters to create what was called a board of freeholders. 15 freeholders appointed by the city's board of trustees, organized in October 1891, including Clinton L. White, the department store owner Harris Weinstock, Hiram Johnson's father, Grove Johnson, who was an attorney and legislator, and 12 other Sacramentans of similar import, most of which I think were members of the Sutter Club. And they decided that Sacramento's new charter should resemble contemporary business structure. Businesses of those era, this was the era of some would call it the Gilded Age, someone might call it the era of the robber barons, but of the unitary executive, of the big man in charge of the company, whether that was Collis Huntington for Southern Pacific or the Vanderbilts or any other, the Carnegies, J.P. Morgan. These were the big men in charge of industry, and so their vision was for a big man in charge of the city. Similar systems were enacted in other large American cities, New York City and Chicago, San Francisco and LA. It wasn't so much a new system as it was a popular system of that era, and focused on a unitary executive, and often with politics distributed throughout the city via wards. The city was divided into 9 wards, which each elected their own ward trustee and a member of the city board of education. Both were part-time, but the mayor was full-time. The mayor was paid $3,000 a year. That's equivalent to about $90,000 a year today, so a respectable professional salary, if not too enormously generous. And the mayor appointed all unelected city officers, city clerk, chief of police, and police officers, the surveyor, superintendent of streets, fire chief, superintendent of cemeteries, and the waterworks. It was popular with businessmen, less popular with civic reformers. The first such mayor was Bernard Ulmer Steinman. He was the first strong mayor. He took over when the new charter was adopted, and he actually did quite a bit other than that. He called for a public meeting after his election to form a chamber of commerce. The Sacramento Chamber of Commerce actually still technically exists today. It's the Sacramento Metro Chamber, so it's a regional chamber rather than city specific, but it's still around. It dates from this era. And again, the Chamber of Commerce used principally the founders of it were the same people who were involved with the Board of Freeholders and who had started the Sutter Club just a few years earlier. And they were intended to be the voice of Sacramento's private industry. Now, this era was not without its troubles. The last half of the 19th century was the railroad era, and the railroad era was a lot like the tech era, principally unregulated, lots and lots of money, but more money involved more money was possible in starting companies than in running them. And they resulted in some fairly spectacular explosions of the economy, which is why in the last half of the 19th century, part of the reason why people associate that era with criminals and bank robbers and things like that. Well, there were several major economic depressions and lots of people out of work. And the Panic of 1893 was one of those collapses, and it collapsed on Sacramento as well. In early 1894, a group arrived at the front door of our city called the Army of the Unemployed that had gone from Los Angeles to San Francisco with an intent of marching all the way to Washington, D.C. They didn't get the whole way, but they did stop in Sacramento, and it caused a lot of panic because here's this group of 1,000 unemployed men, looks like a large, scary mob. We actually gave them a place to camp, including Snowflake Park, which is an old ballpark at 28th and R Street, and inside of Sutter's Fort. While the central building of Sutter's Fort, the only surviving portion of the original fort, was being rehabbed a few years ago, they found graffiti from the Industrial Army from their stay there in spring of 1894. And Sacramento had its own industrial army, as I mentioned. The Central Pacific Railroad, now known as the Southern Pacific, operated remotely from San Francisco. And Sacramentans had a lot of grudges with Southern Pacific in that they owned the waterfront. This is Front Street right here. And they didn't take particularly good care of it. They had about a third of the jobs in San Francisco and Sacramento were for the railroad. The saying was either you worked for the railroad or you worked for the canneries or you fed somebody who did either job. So they were the major employer. About 2/3 of the way across the country, there was a similar town called Pullman, Illinois, which was owned by the Pullman Company. It was more directly a factory town than Sacramento, and it became one of the early headquarters and bases for membership of the American Railway Union, founded by Eugene Debs, who was a railway man himself. And one of the other major American Railway Union membership centers was Sacramento. And during this era, 1893 and 94, there's an economic crisis going on. Pullman is selling fewer cars, but they still have to maintain their city of workers. So they raise the rent, but cut wages, and resulting in a squeeze that probably looks pretty familiar to a lot of people today. Low wages and higher rent result in a whole lot of civil unrest. And things were different in Sacramento to some extent, but only a little bit. The workers of Pullman, American Railway Union members, because they were Boilermakers and shops workers. They weren't allowed to join the existing railroad unions, which were principally for firemen, conductors, engineers, the train crew, rather than the workers who worked on the locomotives and built them. And so they struck, and that spread across the country because other ARU chapters were considered themselves obligated to strike in sympathy. And so the workers of the Southern Pacific shops here in Sacramento decided to strike. Now, that had dramatic consequences for California because the Southern Pacific Shop's location, right on the main paths north and south along the Pacific coast, and then east and west to and from San Francisco, were critical. And the shops is the crossroads for those. And if you shut down the shops, you shut down the entire railroad system. And that's exactly what they did. So that meant that industry in Sacramento temporarily came to a screeching halt. This was July of 1894. And here's the Central Pacific station, the old arcade station. It's roughly where the tracks are now, and the shops buildings themselves are just behind it. And there were some attempts by federal agents to convince the strikers to go back to work. They were mostly laughed out of the place. And there was a second effort by Mayor Steinman. And also, I mentioned Harris Weinstock of the Weinstock Lubin department store. He was one of the commanders of the local militia. They were called out. I mentioned the Sacramento ZOUAVES. They were disbanded by this point, but there were many other local militias, small local groups carrying arms who would be called out in time of emergency. And they were called upon on July 4th weekend to remove the strikers from the shops. Now, they were essentially the militia was in a very precarious position. These were their neighbors, their friends, their family members, and this was a hot 4th of July. A lot of armed men pointing rifles at the shops workers who refused to budge. And a kid with a firecracker on that Independence Day weekend could have caused a disaster. But what happened is that the local militias stood down. They, in some cases, they handed their firearms to the strikers and left. And this left the mayor and the governor in kind of a pickle because the military force they had called out had refused to dislodge the strikers. So they got federal assistance. And so forces from San Francisco were brought to Sacramento. And these were Army regulars. So they were not going to stand down. They didn't have the emotional or familial connections with the Sacramento ARU members. And the ARU knew this. So in advance of the federal troops arriving, they actually left town. But they wouldn't have done so if federal troops hadn't been called in to dislodge them. This was, in a lot of ways, it was a national turning point for American labor and for the city of Sacramento. And I mentioned Harris Weinstock. For the rest of his life, he was very much supportive of unions and of workers' rights to organize, in part perhaps because of what he saw there at the shops and the unity of the workers and essentially the dire straits that they were in and the unwillingness to do something fairly terrible in order to dislodge them. Slightly less large scale, but still a controversy. Mayor Steinman in 1896, it was revealed that he had been sleeping with the wife of David Lubin, who was the other owner of the Weinstock Lubin department store, well known as a philanthropist and promoter of agricultural technology. And this dust-up happened after Steinman's time in office, but it resulted in the scandal was such that David Lubin left Sacramento never to return. There were some pretty amazing things that happened during this era that were a bit more positive. What was known as the Electric Carnival happened on Admission Day, September 9th, 1895, when the long-distance power lines from Folsom were connected to Sacramento on the other end in Folsom, the Folsom Powerhouse, the first large-scale long-distance transmission of high-voltage electrical power from Folsom to Sacramento that gave Sacramento a large, cheap power supply. That happened during this era, but it wasn't so much because of any change in city government as just it happened to be coincidental to it. The technology and the money had arrived at the same time. And the company that did that, Sacramento Electric, Gas and Railway Company, was the later name, that later became part of Pacific Gas and Electric. And PG&E, the company that was formed, was the other large influence peddler in town, like Southern Pacific, which was an influence peddler on a state and national scale. Often it's said that when the state of California changed its constitution, so a new railroad commission was created in order to limit the power of railroads. Southern Pacific actually was pretty happy about it, because instead of having to pay half of the legislature to vote their way, they only had to pay 2 out of the 3 railroad commissioners. And that's really the relationship that a lot of big corporate entities had with governance, is they saw government as transactional. I give you a thing and you give me a thing back, versus the idea of government as mediator, as everybody comes to government and gets treated the same way, whether or not you have a thing to give or not. And like, say, the strikers, which more than the progressives of the era were the left of that era, were saying we want fairness and equal treatment. And the view of corporate America is, no, we don't want fairness and equal treatment. We have all the money, and we think we deserve better treatment because, gosh, we have the money. And if you do, then we'd be happy to share our money with you. Another thing that was happening during this era, the 1880s and early 1890s, was suburban expansion. This is Oak Park, the first suburb of Sacramento. And you can see here it says no city taxes. Well, one of the developers behind the Oak Park addition was, again, Mayor B.U. Steinman. It had its own electric railroad to carry people from downtown Sacramento to the new suburb outside the city limits, and its own cool, hip brew pubs like the Roostaller, or I'm sorry, well, they served Roostaller, but this is Steen's Bar, serving Roostaller beer in Oak Park. So that was the first hipster brew pub in Oak Park. They seem to have something of a comeback. The electric railroad also had the benefit that it meant electric power lines had to go to this new neighborhood. So typically the same set of interlocking companies would sell land in the new development. They would sell electricity to the people who moved to the land, and they would sell rides on the streetcar to and from work. So you sort of have 3 interlocking sets of companies. And this was very common all throughout the United States. If any of you have studied the history of Los Angeles and read about Henry Huntington, he did exactly the same thing. Borax Smith in the Bay Area and the Key System, exactly the same thing. And a lot of the same parties, the members of the principal behind Oak Park, Edwin Alsip, again, a member of the Chamber of Commerce, of course, and a member of the Sutter Club. There's a view of Oak Park when it was just called Oak Park, later called Joyland, and today McClatchy Park. Clinton L. White, he was one of the original board of freeholders, he was an attorney. He was one of the later strong mayors of Sacramento, 1907, 1908. And he was also a real estate developer, and he converted Sacramento's original fairgrounds, located at 20th and 8th Street, to the new development of Boulevard Park. So again, this land trade, it was within the city limits, unlike Oak Park, which was at that time outside the city limits. And Clinton White was also involved with the effort to bring that second railroad to Sacramento. Like Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe had done so much for Los Angeles and Oakland, Clinton White heard there's a final transcontinental railroad, Western Pacific, that's going to be coming through, and they really need a city where there are railroad workers because they need a location for their central shops. And so those shops were located in what's now Curtis Park, recently redeveloped. But the government of the city of Sacramento, just prior to Clinton White becoming mayor, was very much opposed to this because Southern Pacific doesn't want the competition. And so Clinton White was able to arrange a plebiscite, a vote of the entire population on whether or not they should let Western Pacific come through town, which they won handily. And that helped advance Clinton White to the mayor's office. Unfortunately, while we did get something of a bump from the existence of Western Pacific, by this time there were federal efforts to regulate railroad rates, and so we didn't see the land explosion that other cities did. Black voters under strong mayor were in a slightly different position because this was ward based. There were 4 wards downtown, 4 wards kind of out in what's now Midtown, and a ninth ward in the middle. The the waterfront wards in what's became known as the West End were principally working class and very often communities of color. And so the votes of that half of the city became crucial to the strong mayors. And so they sought the votes of African Americans, of Chinese, and yes, these were voting parties. The first generation of Chinese who came to the United States were ineligible for citizenship, but very often their children born in the United States were. And I've been going through voter rolls today, and it's something I really want to spend more time doing. But there were Chinese voters and African American voters on voter rolls, and it's a little hard in some cases to determine the race of the voter, but in some cases I recognize the name, or they're people that I've seen before, so I'm able to tell that, okay, these are definitely voting parties. And I've talked about the West End Club before, and this is William Snow, president of the West End Club, and their headquarters at 4th and L Street. And one of the reasons why he started the West End Club was to create a black equivalent of the Sutter Club that would help consolidate political power for Sacramento's African American community. It wasn't the only party doing so. There were also the 2 founding black churches in Sacramento, St. Andrew's AME and Shiloh Baptist Church, and they also had just a little bit of political power, but enough to give them an edge. And in return, very often, the communities that supported the mayor, again, had a transactional relationship. You support us, and we will look the other way at certain things, or we'll provide employment for the members of your community. And those became very controversial issues because of that transactional basis. Instead of government based on fairness and objectivity, it's you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. But at this point, as I've talked about in other talks, the African American community is focused on survival. How can we do what we can to get by, to survive in a community where we're about 1% of the population? And here we can see that they are a political force to the extent that they can be within the city of Sacramento. There's an article from the Sacramento Union on Sacramento's black community and some of its leaders appointing people to the state convention. And there's some of the names talked about. Reverend J. Gordon McPherson, there's a photo of him on the right, and also Robert Fletcher, the fairly amazing Civil War veteran I've talked about in other talks, were among the leaders of this community and took great pride in their position. That transaction applied across other racial lines and other ethnic lines. Sacramento, that trip through the voter rolls, again, you can't tell too much by names, but a lot of Italians who were almost universally Republican. The Chinese, also Republican. African Americans voted almost universally Republican. The Irish, lots of Democrats. Slavic peoples, there were a lot of people. The term that was commonly used in Sacramento was Slavonians, but largely from what's now Croatia, were also part of this. And we're going to talk about some people from that community, but they were also engaging in this transaction. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You vote for the political authorities at the time, and you'll receive a benefit. And that was the basis of Strong Mayor. We talked about the Chinese community. And as I said, the second generation of Chinese, American-born, American citizens with the right to vote, they're again, like the African American community, a small community struggling for survival. And so if they're offered, hey, here's a benefit that you can take advantage of, damn right they're going to take it. It's to their advantage to do so. No one else is offering to help them. Talked a little bit about streetcars. Albert Gallatin, who built what's now the historic governor's mansion for his home, was the principal factor involved in the long distance power lines. But as I mentioned, that long distance power transmission, PG&E, was the other big political force. The Southern Pacific shops and the workers there, the representation of the workers in the shops, which the ARU had been wiped out by the Pullman strike, but they still needed representation. And also the brewers, lots of Germans. Another thing I noticed in the voter rolls, there were a lot of socialists in the West End. Not a ton, but quite a few, and very often with German surnames. So I'm still trying to find out more about that. Marshall Beard is one of the names that's most associated with the era of strong mayor in Sacramento, and find a little bit about him. He came to Sacramento in 1871, became a registered voter in 1876, and he worked for H.S. Crocker Stationery Supplier. He started his own stationery and book company in 1880. He was appointed superintendent of schools by the Board of Trustees in 1886, served 2 terms, and he was mayor 1906 to 7, reelected 1910 to 1912. Now, some of you who read some of the descriptions for this noted that strong mayor ended in 1911, but this guy, Mayor Beard, kept on as mayor. That's because there was a lot of continuity between strong mayor and the system that followed it, the commission system. One thing that happened, and another thing that happened in 1911 is that the city of Sacramento annexed a lot of its neighbors. And you can't see too much of East Sacramento or Land Park, but they became part of the city as well as Oak Park. And it was really Oak Park, which had the population, that dragged the other 2 suburbs into the city limits. And that resulted in a big change in the way the city was dealt with. And one thing that had happened in about 1906 is that the city voted to stop the ward system. So instead of the 4 wards in the West End and 4 wards in the Holmes district and in Midtown and 1 in the middle, they just did a citywide election. This meant that almost nobody representing the poorer parts of the city was elected to the city commissioners. Ed Carragher was part of the city's democratic apparatus, considered very, very allied with Southern Pacific and also with the local bar interests. He was the owner of the Saddle Rock restaurant on 2nd Street. It was a restaurant that dated back to 1849. And he, like Beard, was part of the power structure during the strong mayor era, but also during the commission era. Now, the 1911 Commission Charter was a step towards professionalism and objectivity via specialization and removing party politics, but their influence is still present. The commission system was based on, instead of a single strong mayor, you'd have a team of 5 people. Each commissioner was in charge of a different part of city government, and they were divided up. The main problem with it is that you would get elected to a position because you got the votes, but didn't mean necessarily had the qualification to run that department. But it was a further step. The Board of Trustees was part-time, but the city commissioners were full-time. So he had 5 full-time people now instead of just the mayor and part-time trustees. There was consolidation and devolution of powers. Officials that were previously elected citywide were turned into appointed positions. The Board of Education went to being an independent commission to being a city commission under the city's educational commissioner with a Board of Education. So instead of 1 full-time executive, you had 5. And then former mayor appointments were now moved under the relevant commissioner. So the education commissioner was in charge of appointments for the schools. The health commissioner was in charge of appointment for the waterways and such. There were several controversies also that spurred that move from strong into commission. There was the caretaker trust, where the city cemetery was being run by a team of folks who had been hired because they'd agreed to vote a certain way, and in many cases they were not maintaining lots equitably, or they were charging fees privately in order to keep things maintained. And this became a big flap. And Ed Carragher, I mentioned, was part of the political machine, was one of the people who took the most umbrage to this. And in some ways, Carragher was kind of a floater in that he was part of the old school Democrat party politics system, but he also sided with the Republican progressives on many issues. And he also he had, in a lot of cases, an open mind to a lot of different perspectives. Now, when we talk about the term progressives, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that it does today. The way I'd describe it, it's more of a middle class liberal, and the progressives were an offshoot of the Republican Party that really started to emerge as a middle class population interested in progress and modernity, in new ways of dealing with problems, some of which ended up being a little weird, but in some cases they were very effective, and they were also the party of women's rights and in some cases of an environmentalism and limitation on corporate power. And so they saw that unitary executive of the 19th century, the robber baron, as not something that they wanted to keep, and in favor of moving towards a more distributed power model. And they lived, for the most part, in what we now call Midtown, in the eastern part of the city, what was called the Holmes District. And they were personified in Sacramento's native son and son of Grove Johnson, Governor Hiram Johnson, and his platform, 1910, 1911, again, that era when when the city charter changed, he ushered in a lot of this change, including the rights of women to vote in California. And a lot of his uh, anti-corruption crusading was based on reaction to his father. Uh, lots of rebellious kids go, "Hell with you, Dad! I'm going to do my own thing." And Grove Johnson was known for not only for Democratic Party politics, but Republican Party politics. He changed parties a couple times, but also was affiliated in some ways with some of this political insider trading and corruption. And so Hiram saw himself as the natural person to rise above that. Uh, One of the members of the first new city commission, one of the most significant ones, is Luella Johnston. She was the first woman elected to city council in California and possibly in the United States for a major city. So a major political figure. She actually had um, been involved with politics well before women got the vote. She took a local club called the Tuesday Club, which had principally been more of a women's reading club, book club, and she turned it into a political organization. One of the other strong mayors, William Hassett, was printing manager for her husband, A.J. Johnston. And when A.J. Johnston died, Luella took over his printing business. And gee, if you have a printing business, you can do things like print protest signs or political signs. It's always good to know someone who buys their ink by the gallon. And Luella Johnston uh, also personified another element of the progressive movement, which was the fight against what was characterized as white slavery, which was um, sex trafficking. And by the name, the implication is that it's only slavery if it's white women who are being trapped into it. There are plenty of women of color who are trapped in the same situation who are of less concern to the progressives, but the West End was also known in the 1890s and early 1900s as the Tenderloin, and it was an area of essentially tolerated semi-legal prostitution, especially along 2nd Street and L Street, the two main armatures of the Tenderloin. And cleaning up that area was part of the city's concern, and in a lot of ways, the progressives' concern and the strong mayor folks' concern, because their whole thing, remember, was trying to bring attention back to Sacramento and take back our natural place as one of the major cities on the West Coast, which they never quite did. But the assumption was that if we just clean up the West End, which to them meant ridding it of nightlife and sex work, and in some cases, to be frank about it, the communities of color that they considered unacceptable from the waterfront. But these were shared goals of both. Keep our schools uncontaminated sounds a little scary. It was an ad for Edward Haynes running for Commissioner of Education, and they're talking about George Radonich. We talked a little bit about that. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. George Radonich was part of the Slavonian community, and he wanted to be a police officer, but he was too short. But he was a buddy of Marshall Beard's, and so Marshall Beard took pity on him and made him a member of the police. And because he was kind of short, I guess, small in stature, he actually got his leg broken and left the force, and he became the manager of one of the fairly notorious saloons, the Gem, on 2nd and K Street. And so this advertisement talks about how the influence of folks like George Radonich and other uh, West End characters like Joe Fusky, an Italian immigrant who was actually deported out of the United States for trafficking in women, um, how he would keep Sacramento free from that kind of sinister and dangerous influence that they brought to the city. So a lot of the politics of this era, pretty frankly, explicitly based on race. Speaking of which, this was an era of ascendant racism in that things had been pretty racist. Things got ever slightly so less racist in the 19th century, in the last half of the 19th century. And then in the early 20th century, they're starting to get much more racist again. And part of it was because of a movie called Birth of a Nation. It was originally a play called The Klansman. And remember, I'd mentioned that the African American community had, to some extent, a transactional relationship with the strong mayor government and lost their ability to vote for someone who would represent their ward in about 1906. So 1910 through 1915, they're trying to find other ways to organize. And so they protested in louder and louder form each time two stage productions of The Klansman and then its motion picture premiere. The first two were essentially ignored, but Ed Carragher, the same person we talked about before, he was the first city administrators that actually said, you know, we have to do something about this. They didn't actually ban the movie, but they cut out portions of the film that had resulted in race riots where white people were so enraged by what they saw on the screen that they went out and lynched black people. And so that he felt that's a clear danger to the citizens of Sacramento. And so one thing that we saw during this era, during the um, essentially, in a lot of ways, this commission system is part two of the strong mayor system because it's the same players, the same people, but with less power for a lot of people like the African American community. And so, what do? They learn how to enhance their own power. Another thing I was kind of curious about that I found looking at the registrar of voters is that black women in Sacramento were registered to vote and did vote. And the only reason I know that is because I recognize some of the names. Fannie Ray Grubbs, whose house still exists at 26th and S Street. It's a wonderful purple color now. And then Maud Flood. She was a chiropodist who is the daughter of Dr. R.J. Fletcher, who I had talked about before, also a registered voter, both Republicans. And another person I talked about a lot in my previous talks, Grant Cross, aka Skewball, who was the other person along with William Snow running the West End Club or the Eureka Club. He and his wife Rose, both registered Republicans who both voted. And so these are small incidences of power, probably not completely commonplace. Plenty of people who were in these communities couldn't vote or just didn't have access to the vote, but some did, and they held on to that power very tenaciously because it's in many cases all they had. Another thing that I talked about in my African American history talks is the Churchill Dance Hall, which is located at 5th and M Street, and it was in some cases notorious as a place where uh, black and white kids got together to listen to this cool new music that wasn't quite yet called jazz, but the name was just coming up, and got into heat with the city council for doing so. They were also the polling place for this part of the city, for Sacramento's African American community. And perhaps I think the Chinese community was pretty close to there, and then the Japanese American community, the Nisei generation, the first ones born in the United States and thus eligible to vote, weren't yet quite a voting age, but they if they reached voting age, this was their polling place. And ran across a pretty interesting account in 1914 of the West End Club advocating for the rights of this community and making many promises, as many promises as they could to the people who were running for office. When normally it's supposed to be the other way around. The candidate's supposed to make promises to the citizens, not citizens making promises to the candidates. But again, they're trying to transact. to do business for the rights of their community because the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a progressive organization of women, wanted to remove this polling place because they felt that the Churchill Dance Hall as a sinister establishment would be a bad influence on the youth. However, if you took that polling place away, it meant that people of color had to go to a polling place in the Holmes district where their own safety was potentially in danger. Further out in the suburbs, in Oak Park, another step in that political power was the coming of T. Allen Harvey, Sacramento's first African American candidate for public office. He had already pretty much made a splash in the city by preaching at St. Andrews, by starting his own church, and by starting the Sacramento chapter of the NAACP and winning Sacramento's first discrimination lawsuit against a restaurant owner who refused him service in Oak Park. And T. Allen Harvey ran for office in 1919 under the commission system, and he gave a fairly convincing, good accounting of himself. He didn't win, but he didn't come in last, and he also ran again in 1921 under the system that followed the commission system. Okay, and I've been corrected, so I will point this out. Beard was never on the commission. He was elected. He was 1912, but Beard, so he was not a mayor during the commission system. So thank you for pointing that out, and I will include that in my notes for the next time I give this talk. Another organization that T. Allen Harvey founded was the CRISPUS Soldiers and Sailors Club, and this was in 1919. It was intended for African American veterans, in some ways similar to the Sacramento ZOUAVES of 50 years earlier, and in some ways similar to the Black Panther Party for self-defense of 50 years later, in that this was during the Red Summer, 1919. Again, racism was ascendant. The Republican Party was actively distancing itself from its African American members by splitting into two factions, the Black and Tan and the Lily Whites. Guess which was which? And so groups like this were intended that if it was necessary for the Black community to defend themselves from the kind of assaults that were being seen all throughout the country during the Red Summer of 1919, they would be capable of doing those. So far as I know, it was never actually called into action. Other sorts of struggles during this era, 1913, again during the commission system era, Kelly's army arrived in Sacramento. Major Kelley, now General Kelley, had been part of the Army of the Unemployed that came in 1894. 1913 was another economic depression, and so another Army of the Unemployed came. Rather than being allowed to pass through Sacramento, they were stopped at Sacramento and pushed back into Yolo County by force. There was a fairly large uprising, but this happened during the commission system. And then in 1918, a bomber actually planted a bomb on the back porch of the California governor's mansion. This resulted in the arrest and attempted conviction of a large number of the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, which were another Eugene Debs organization, started later, and they were called the Silent Defenders because they knew that this was a show trial. It would be useless for them to testify, so they sat silent in court. And this was also during the 1918-19 pandemic, and they were in jail in very close quarters, and several of them died of the flu while awaiting trial. So it became apparent over the course of the second decade of the 20th century that the commission system had its flaws. In many ways, it was essentially a repetition of the strong mayor system with a few subjective changes. And so the method that the next system, also entirely put forth by the Sacramento Chamber of Commerce, probably also entirely by members of the Sutter Club, was the council manager system, which is the basis for the one that we have today. It operates a little differently, but it was still done where instead of by wards, it was an at-large system. So you'd vote for people citywide, and as a result, the main people who got elected to the city council were people from the wealthy parts of town. The mayor was not directly elected. It was the person who got the most votes, and that was the basis for picking who the mayor was. The other element of it was that a city manager would be in charge of operations, and this was because of a change of corporate structure. They still wanted to use corporate structure as a model for city government, but instead of the unitary executive, they would have a board of directors and then a CEO who was hired by the board of directors and could be fired by that board of directors at any time. And the mayor initially was like the president of the board of directors, where they're part of that team elected from their number, but the actual carrying out of orders was done by a professional. The assumption was that because that person was not subject to election, they would be less subject to corruption, whereas the electeds would decide on policy and general direction instead of doing things like the hiring and firing of day-to-day staff. But this was not the end of Sacramento's charter changes. One that I just want to touch on very briefly is the one that happened in 1971. And this was, in many results, again, Black history is Sacramento history. The civil rights movement drove a lot of changes to many cities, and Sacramento was certainly no exception. Rather than the at-large system, we switched to council districts were a good idea. So we'd have representation for one representative for each part of the city, and then a citywide mayor. And the job of the mayor was herding cats, essentially creating consensus among these representatives of the different members of the council, still playing a leadership role like the president of the board, but being elected directly to the presidency by the voters instead of by the other members of the council. And then with that, a professional city manager. And so here we see Milton McGee, who he actually was elected before the the system was changed. Robert Matsui, Manuel Ferrales, also who was first elected in '69 and then reelected. Phil Eisenberg, Ann Rudin, Richard Marriott, and I couldn't find a photo of Robbie Robertson. But this is the system essentially that we have today, and it has changed pretty significantly since 1921. So, couple summary point. Yeah, okay, you're right. That's okay. You're right. I think that's a photo. That's Burnett Miller there, and then Richard Marriott is to the right of him. Okay. Nick has some great comments here. Apparently, they were originally elected by proportional representation, but it was struck down by the courts. And let's see. Okay. I got a question from Junior Goris. Is there any way that the politicians in power could find out the way an individual voted? That's a good question. I do not know. Generally, voting is going to be anonymous, and it's pretty hard to track, especially prior to things like electronic voting. But presumably you wouldn't know. But one of the things that the common practices of that era, it was actually used as a justification for the strong mayor charter, was that people would go down to the West End and grab people sitting at the bars and essentially hand them a coin to go down to the polling place and vote for their representative. And in a lot of ways, that assumption on the part of the powers that were that people in the West End, working people were almost treated as children, that they didn't have the ability to decide who their leaders would be, and that they would only vote if they were paid to do so. And if so, then it made sense for people in the position to pay them to get their way. It's a dangerous assumption that runs counter to a lot of the social movements of the 20th century after this, largely as a result of the excesses of this era, whether it was the middle class revolutionaries of the progressive era or the socialists and the far left, the unionists, and then the civil rights activists who said, no, we're every much as citizen as you are, and we're entitled to exactly the same rights. Women are entitled to the same rights. People of color are entitled to the same rights. So that's kind of the challenge now that we're seeing in our contemporary milieu is which system works better? Is a return to a more transactional system something that's going to get the job done. And then the question is, what job needs doing and who's paying to do it? If anyone wants to ask a question live, if you hit the button to raise your hand, I'd be happy to put you on the mic. And then there's one more question coming in the Q&A. Okay. Yeah, we switched from strong mayor for what reason exactly? It was too transactional for business and others didn't like it. Businesses seem to like the fact that it was transactional, especially the bigger businesses like Southern Pacific and PG&E. But it was more of the smaller businesses, the middle class, that felt like they were being forced out by that. And they didn't like the fact that the way they felt is that the working class population of the West End were being used as a lever against the rest of the city. Part of what Clinton White did in bringing Western Pacific Railroad is that it almost created two cities, because remember, the Southern Pacific Depot was downtown. It's roughly, like I said, it's where the shops are now, where the tracks are now, and near the current Southern Pacific Depot. But the Western Pacific Depot, if people know where it is, it's the old spaghetti factory on 19th and J Street. So it's a mile and a half from downtown. The Clinton White and a lot of the progressives are saying, we want a separate railroad for the middle class that is not part of the Southern Pacific political machine and the industrial working class neighborhood of downtown. Okay, got a question from Gerald O'Connor. Isn't that okay? Did Sacramento experience the kind of patronage system that developed in other cities, hiring and firing based on who you knew rather than merit? When did civil service begin in city hiring? That's a good question. And yes, one of the main features of the strong mayor system was patronage, in that you got hired or fired because of who you knew, and that was based on political influence rather than merit. The civil service system began with the commission system, the 1911 charter, and then it was codified by the council manager system in 1921. And that kind of was a turning point for the city. There was an event called the Days of 49. Before there was an old Sacramento, there was a summer-long celebration of the history of Sacramento. And keep in mind, this is 1921, so this is right after the big pandemic. And as we're all finding out now, it's a frustrating experience being in a pandemic. And it took a couple of years for Sacramento to hash out its political differences. But once they did, they said, we're going to have a big street party. And that's what the Days of 49 were. And then later on, it became the inspiration for a similar gathering in 1939, and perhaps the inspiration for Old Sacramento. All right. Well, I don't see. Let me see. Okay, there's one other Q&A. Was it difficult to get rid of the strong mayor system once it was in place? Considering the fact that most of the people, Clinton L. White was one of the people who wrote the strong mayor charter, but he also wrote the commission charter. The same people were involved with both systems, so it was not particularly difficult to get rid of because the same people were doing it. They found out after almost 20 years that it was benefiting some people but not others, and a lot of that change came from the change in the ways that things like political patronage was perceived. It was a fairly heavy lift. It's never complex to change a city's chart. It's never not complex to change a city's charter, and really it shouldn't be easy because it's a fairly dramatic decision to make. Um, so it was done, and it wasn't easy or fast. And then, as I said, because the commission system had its own problems, it was more of a second half of the strong mayor system, followed by the final change to council manager in 1921. All right. Well, thank you for being here and for tuning in, and vote no on Measure A. This has been your political moment. And if you're interested in more stories along these lines, my books are available at Capitol Books on K Street, right next to the Crest Theater. A lot of the stories that you heard tonight were in my books, Wicked Sacramento and also Sacramento's K Street. And then I have quite a bit on the 1971 charter change in the Midtown Sacramento book. So good night, and thanks for tuning in.